So, good afternoon, everybody. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you today to the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies lecture by Dr. Vincent Manning. And Vincent is Executive Director of Catholics for AIDS Prevention and Support, CAPS, and he's also Executive Producer for Positive Faith. The Positive Faith Project offers advice and support for anyone concerned about or diagnosed with HIV. In advance of World AIDS Day on December the 1st, we're particularly delighted to have Vincent join us to speak on this really important topic and tell us about the amazing work that his charity does. Vincent has written on the many articles on positive Catholics and on topics related to HIV and faith. He's engaged in sustained theological reflection, and he's published 12 articles about the situation of people living with HIV in the UK and why the National Christian HIV Peer Support Ministry Positive Catholics is needed. In 2011, for instance, he published an article on Julian of Norwich and a pastoral approach to HIV and AIDS. In 2017, he wrote on HIV and the Body of Christ. In 2019, he completed his doctoral thesis at St. Mary's University on encountering Christ through the passion of HIV, an inquiry into the theological meaning of HIV in the Church. So we are absolutely delighted to welcome him today, and the title of his lecture is Making Faith Sense of HIV, an Introduction. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Trish, very much indeed for that lovely introduction and welcome. You've saved me saying a few things, so that's great. It will save on time. So I'm going to leap straight into my prepared script, which I'm hoping will keep me on track, and I intend to make a short presentation for about 20 minutes in the hope that we will have time for discussion and sharing. So making faith sense of HIV, an introduction. So this year marks the 40th anniversary of the start of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. So I thought we'd have a very brief historical recap and make some very broad brush points about how the Church responded to the AIDS pandemic as it emerged. I'm also aware, because I know of some of the people who've arrived, that some of what I say today will be kind of a bit too basic for some people. But I've learned over the years not to presume that people know as much as I think I sometimes presume people do know. I mean, that's one of the issues that we might come on to. I'm also conscious that we're talking in the context of university, so hopefully there might be some people here who weren't alive in the 1980s or the 1990s. So we'll start with a very brief overview, and what I'll be doing is very broad brush strokes, okay, very broad brush, a number of generalizations, a whole bunch of stuff, but it's an introduction. After we do a little bit of a recap of history, we're going to leap forward in time to the present day and explore what the landscape of HIV in the context of Christian faith looks like today. And during that time, I'll describe a little bit about CAPS ministry. Although there are shared features, HIV-related stigma has been the particular characteristic which really distinguishes this pandemic from Ebola or SARS or COVID. I will refer to stigma as a theme directly and indirectly throughout this short presentation. As I've said, the presentation is in no way comprehensive. If it were food, it would constitute a bar snack. And I mean a bag of crisps, not chicken in a basket. And I should be very clear that everything I present, unless explicitly stated otherwise, refers to HIV within a UK context. So my intention is just to share with you a few introductory facts and thoughts. I invite you to jot down any questions or thoughts you have and to notice what stays with you. And I look forward to seeing where our conversation leads us in about 20 minutes. I should state my opening position, which is that as a public health phenomenon and as a subjective experience, HIV is widely misunderstood for many complex reasons. Partly because of this fact, making faith sense of HIV is neither simple nor straightforward. But that's one of the reasons why it makes for rich theological soil in which to dirty our hands together. I will begin the presentation and end the presentation simply with a statement of faith, and I invite you to receive these as a kind of invitation. So immediately following this opening statement, we'll watch two very short video clips to transport us back to the mid-1980s, where we'll begin to revisit history. So let us begin. HIV and AIDS is a sign to us that the passion of Jesus continues in our world. It is a site of the crucifixion, a site of struggle, a site of abandonment, alienation, and rejection. But Christ is present at sites of suffering and challenges us to make a response. Amen. So we'll have our two clips, Carly, please.
So protect yourself. And read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
Most people enjoy an occasional gamble. The fun, the thrill. Even our relationships owe much to chance. But today, if you play around, the stakes are too high because you're gambling with AIDS. Meet someone who is an AIDS carrier, and although condoms give some protection, just one act of intercourse may give you AIDS and lead to death. Sleeping around is a gamble. Casual sex spreads AIDS.
Thank you, Carly. So, campaign ads like these, some of you will remember some of them, they simply wouldn't be run today, I don't think, not least because of factual inaccuracies in them. Can you imagine a campaign like this to warn us about COVID? I think not. The reason I open with them is because I want us to notice and remember the feelings of imminent danger, public threat, and the moral panic they evoke. The music, the language, it's kind of apocalyptic, isn't it? Governments, public health institutions, and the churches were slow to act when AIDS cases first appeared in the bodies of a despised group in society, namely gay men, followed in short order by intravenous drug users, sex workers, haemophiliacs, and black people. The air of panic, as you can see here, is evident in the UK press headlines of the time. Added to these, I'd add, "I'd shoot my son if he had AIDS," says Vicar. And AIDS, it's spreading like wildfire. Now, I think we can take the display away if possible, Carly, now, until the next ones. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Look, the point about this is I want to make the point that I think any theological consideration of what HIV means must, in my opinion anyway, start with this memory of HIV and AIDS as a site of fear, of vilification, and of blame. AIDS devastated whole communities, and it was experienced as something truly horrific, not only because AIDS symbolized a painful and disfiguring death, but because it represented a shameful death, suffered often in isolation. Now, institutional church responses were muted. Prior to 1986, in public at least, no response was the official response. The loudest Christian voices were often highly judgmental and condemnatory. AIDS was God's judgment on homosexuality. That was the message that most people received in the public domain, I would suggest. By the early 1990s, while some bishops debated whether or not condoms could be distributed in Catholic health facilities, some priests, some religious sisters, and many more ordinary Christian men and women fulfilled the Christian obligation to care for the sick, often volunteering in HIV sector charities. More importantly, I want to remember that the signs of what it means to be church were evident within these marginalized communities of people living directly with HIV and dying from AIDS. The practical theologian Stephen Patterson, writing in 1990, describes his encounter with affected and infected people as, and I quote, a spiritual experience in the most worthwhile sense. He describes people living with AIDS as bearing witness to, and I quote, the life, love, reconciliation, and community alongside isolation, fear, and destruction. I want to remember that many ordinary Christians who lived through those years testified to similar experiences of conversion. There's something here about what happens when we risk encounter with those whom we fear or consider as other, how we receive more than we thought was available, often in surprising ways from those who are disregarded or despised. After a slow start, there were more than 50 specifically Christian groups or charities offering support to people living with HIV in the UK by 1993. To paraphrase Pope Francis, ordinary Christian people saw where love was needed and acted accordingly. Amongst these was Catholic AIDS Link. We can have that slide now, Carly, which was the predecessor charity to CAPS, which I represent today. So the negative impact of unsympathetic and hostile Christian responses was ameliorated for many through personal pastoral encounters and Christian activism. And these two slides, they just show on the left the Pietà, you'll see that clearly, I'm sure, which became the Catholic AIDS Link symbol. That's a piece of needlework done by Penny Pendergast to show what the experience of HIV and AIDS was like at that time for many people. It spoke to many, many people. And on the right-hand side, that's actually much, much bigger. It's a much bigger piece of fabric. It's a quilt panel. And around it, you can see all the smaller panels, each of which was made by somebody whose loved one had died from AIDS. So these are symbols of the time, I suppose. Thank you, Carly. I want to be clear about this period. The long Christian tradition of linking sex, disease, and sin, especially when confronted with death, ensures that the story of HIV begins not just with a life-threatening disease, not just with a public health emergency, but with the stigma attached to it. And we'll return to stigma later. I want to take us forward now to the mid-1990s and the so-called Lazarus effect. More effective treatments for HIV began to drastically reduce the number of deaths from AIDS by the mid to late 90s. The effect of antiretrovirals was so dramatic that became known as the Lazarus effect, referencing the story in John's Gospel when Jesus restored life to Lazarus, who'd been dead for 4 days. People who had been skeletal, may be marked with the purple lesions of skin cancers, unable to walk or swallow, in great pain, were brought back to life in remarkably short periods of time often. It was quite extraordinary. I should say, if a person is diagnosed with HIV today and undergoes successful ARV treatment, the virus in their body is reduced to undetectable levels, which also means that they can't pass HIV on to another person. You may have heard this message as U equals U, or undetectable equals untransmissible. So back to the 90s. Now, as AIDS as a global pandemic became apparent and more urgent, attention quite properly shifted to AIDS as an international development issue. As attention shifted, and as HIV came to be thought of not as a death sentence, but as a manageable chronic condition, so one by one, the Christian HIV agencies that had existed all closed. In the UK today, CAPS is the only national, specifically Christian HIV agency that seeks to address the pastoral and spiritual needs of all people living in the UK today. And I ask the question at this point, why is this? Why is CAPS still operating a ministry for people living with HIV when so many others have left the scene? Okay, so we're going to leap forward to the present now, particularly to avoid the trap of viewing HIV and AIDS as just an historical event. It is not. It remains an ongoing global pandemic. Today, an estimated 37.7 million people live with HIV globally. But very often, commonly, people think of HIV and AIDS as a past event, or as something that matters somewhere else, far away. But not here, not in our neighbourhood, not in our church. But there are 105,000 people living with HIV in the UK today, and 7,800 living with HIV in Ireland. So people are here in our midst too. I want at this point to speak about the preferential option for the poor, as understood within the tradition of Catholic social thought and practice. In the UK, 1 in 3 people live in poverty, with economic hardship especially pronounced amongst Black people and women living with HIV. Now, like COVID, we know that HIV impacts already marginalised and vulnerable communities disproportionately. Public health messages reassure us that HIV is a manageable medical condition today. And this is true. Whilst HIV is clinically treatable, to live with HIV may not be so manageable for anyone who lives in poverty, or has comorbid conditions, or suffers with mental illness, or has been traumatized, or is isolated, elderly, or lacks networks of social support. So on top of an HIV diagnosis, within this group of people, research shows that people living with HIV are disproportionately impacted by all of the disadvantages I've just mentioned. For example, 72% of people living with HIV have at least one other long-term health condition, and approximately 1 in 3 people living with HIV suffer from mental health conditions. Globally, prevalence of PTSD is 7 times higher compared with the general population. And another study found that risk of suicide is 100 times higher. This risk being especially pronounced within the first year after diagnosis. So to live with HIV is not so manageable for the refugee, or for the elderly gay man, or the woman in an abusive relationship. Of all groups in British or Irish society, perhaps in any society, I propose that people living with HIV in our midst today qualify as the poorest of the poor. And for these reasons, CAP's peer support networks enable people living with HIV to support one another to overcome actual hardship. Our pastoral support worker, Abigail, who's with us today, assists those requiring more specialist one-to-one support or who face an immediate crisis. And she does this through advocacy, signposting, and accompaniment. This includes, for example, accompanying and enrolling a vulnerable person in HIV clinical care, accessing housing support, or specialist legal advice. But at the heart of what we do is the creation of networks of peer support, whereby people living with HIV support, care, and learn from each other. Now, here's a paradox. People living with HIV are more religious than the general population in the UK. So the proportion of the British population identifying as Christian has fallen from 2/3 to just over 1/3 since 1983. So 52% of people in Britain now say they do not belong to any religion. By contrast, an estimated 52% of people living with HIV identify as Christian. Research commissioned by Public Health England in 2017 found that 70% of people living with HIV were identified as religious or spiritual, of whom 49% say their religion was very or fairly important to them. Another study of Black African people living with HIV receiving treatment in London showed that 91% were Christian, which divided to about 35% Roman Catholic and 56% from other Christian traditions. So at a time in history when the church appears to be struggling to remain relevant and is being abandoned by so many, we have here a group of people living with HIV who identify as Christian and say that their faith matters, yet our sisters and brothers living with HIV are not seen or heard in our churches. For these reasons, CAP's Positive Catholics and Positive Faith peer support groups promote the active participation and inclusion of people living with HIV in the life of the church by enabling access to the resources of faith. We do so because the wider church remains a highly stigmatizing environment, which excludes people living with HIV. And we do so because of the lack of adequate pastoral and spiritual care in the churches. We are not an alternative church, but we provide a community of support within which people can come to accept and integrate HIV with their Christian faith, not least because it matters to them. And the good news is that research shows that faith and spirituality, when integrated with HIV status, leads to beneficial health outcomes for people living with HIV. More profoundly, I think, we can, if we are willing, create spaces and communities which allow for a spirituality which can offer healing and liberation. In short, adult Christian faith is good news for people living with HIV. So in summary and in conclusion, very briefly, we revisited the first decades of the pandemic. For those of you who were not there at the time, perhaps I have provided a glimpse, a tiny glimpse, of how traumatic these years were for individuals and for whole communities. Many who lived through it will refer to those times as a type of wartime experience, and this period should not be forgotten. I've indicated how the institutional church was absent from this site of suffering, but how some Christians encountered Christ by going to the margins. Finally, I've described something of the situation of people living with HIV in our midst today, and how CAPS as a community tries to respond. So we'll close now with the final theological statement of faith, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections in a moment. We are changed by the crucified one and the crucified ones of our world, and through them we are challenged to reinterpret our lives in favor of them. Amen.